Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, according to reports, between March 2020 and the first 3 months of this year, over 300 people were killed by parolees. They've also been linked to close to 400 rapes within this period, while over 600 robberies are attributed to them. Now, to find out if there are any interventions and solutions for the parole system, South African National Institute for Crime Prevention and the Reintegration of Offenders CEO Betzi Pierce joins us to speak a bit further on this. Betzi, good morning and thank you very much for your time. You know, that number of parolees who reoffend is honestly concerning and perhaps warrants a broader conversation around the efficacy of the rehabilitation programs that parolees undergo. Are they honestly effective in your view?
They can be effective, but we must also we cannot escape the fact that prison confinement dehumanizes and diminishes individuals, and it results in a lot of former inmates being less capable of effectively reintegrating in society. And more likely, therefore, to break the law and to go back to prison. So, if our programs are not working, and we don't test to see if they are working, we are already in a downward spiral. And unfortunately, we do not see that there's any real data that comes forward from DCS's programs, any data to measure the impact and to look at the effectiveness of these programs. And that is a big concern.
Because there's always been this criticism that you have a department that has a desire to comply by taking these, at least if we talk about the offenders, taking them through the process rather than focusing on the outcomes and having some sort of a victim-centered type of parole system.
Yes, and also a parole system, if we go back to the parole system now, we've got a parole system that inherits a situation where even though people have gone through programs, we've got no knowledge if those programs have the desired impact. And when parole boards sit with this information in front of them, they will look at what the offence was about, what was the person's behaviour in prison, and did he participate in programs, and also is there inclination for this person to improve himself. And they basically have to take a chance on the evidence in front of them to assess if the person poses a risk or not going back into society. But if we look at the context where we are not measuring the impact of the programs, there's a lot of overcrowding in prisons that puts additional pressure on parole boards to release prisoners. And also bearing in fact that the parole board is not there to extend the punishment function. The court has already considered the punishment and dealt out the punishment. They now have to look at this person returning to society. But we've got a lot of gaps in these systems where when parole boards sit with the information in front of them, it might not be information that is effective in helping them to make these decisions, because the information is often very superficial on the person's behaviour in prison.
But beyond the behaviours, let's say somebody was behaving very well, they responded well to perhaps the psychological help that they got while inside. The other real factor is equipping them with skills for them to fend for themselves, because ever so often you find these parolees are released, their families shun them, the community shuns them, but they really cannot fend for themselves, and that's where we see this revolving door of 1 minute you're out and the next you're back in.
No, that's unfortunately that's true. People are exposed to antisocial factors in prison, and often their daily existence is surviving that day. A lot of offenders or prisoners will have to join gangs, or they feel that they need to join gangs so that they can have protection and survive the time in prison. And when they come out, they do not have all the support. They are marginalised and shunned. And the public has a lot of fear around this, because we need to face the fact that a lot of people do come out of prison and they commit heinous crimes, or they just continue on their crime sprees. So there is that marginalization in society, and we do not have enough support in aftercare for people to really turn away from crime and continue with constructive life outside of prison. They're also institutionalized. In that whole period when people are in prison, they have to do what others say they need to do. They are locked up for certain periods. They go out for very short periods, and the rest of the time they spend inside a cell with many other people, and those people are all well versed in crime. So it is a breeding ground for further crime. But that does not say that DCS isn't trying to do something about it, because there are programs. I think the problem here is, again, resources. They overcrowded. They've got they do not have enough staff to work with prisoners. They do not have enough professionals. If you look at prisons, they normally have one, maybe two psychologists and a couple of social workers to deal with this. So there's no real political will behind this to make sure that people are rehabilitated when they go to prison, because we do not have the resources to do so.
But this is a serious concern, and perhaps they do need to prioritize more resources being channeled here, because we end up as ordinary citizens being the victims of the reoffence in most instances. Yes, we perhaps have our role to play in supporting perhaps the post-release program of these parolees by not shunning them in our communities. But nevertheless, one would assume there should be more funds allocated for this process of rehabilitation and ensuring there's enough psychologists and social workers that work with them to protect us when they eventually are released into society.
Yes, and that's not only in prison, that's also when they're released. We also need more resources when people are released, because we do not have integrated and holistic services to prisoners at the moment, or especially on ex-offenders. But looking at the prison, we first have to start with minimum standards and standardized accreditation of programs of service providers, because we've also got a bit of an ad hoc way of dealing with prisoners, and each correctional center will deal with the rehabilitation as best as they can. But there's no standardized processes or standardized programs that spans all the prisons in South Africa. And then secondly, we will need a clear and coherent parole process with regular training and for the parole boards. And then also monitoring and evaluation to ensure that the desired impact of these parole boards are being achieved, because that is also not measured. And although we do have a review board that will look at the function of the parole boards, it's normally after the fact. So the horse is already bolted by the time that process will come in. And South Africa needs a framework on the functions of the parole and parole board. We need clear oversight, and we need involvement from community and community bodies that also clarify on who is ultimately responsible. But when we look at the framework of aftercare outside prison, we really need to stand together and have a very definite framework of who's responsible and who does what for people who are released. Because now a lot of prisoners fall through the cracks because they just don't have proper support once they get out. And again, it's really resource based. In areas where they do have a lot of civil society working with offenders, they have those resources to go to. But in other communities, they just don't have anything. And here we need to look at family preservation, which includes parenting and childcare, and also breaking that pattern of people going back into prison, because we find in a lot of families where the fathers are in prison, the children will end up in prison. So we have to break that link. We also need to do a lot of skills programs, but with these life skills programs need critical thinking, decision making, and resilience building, because we need to face it. Out there is difficult for our people. People are struggling, and equality. There's still a lot of inequality or inequality in our communities, where people do not have access to resources, and a lot of people then tend to turn to crime to be able to exist. And another thing that we find when people come out of prison, they do not have access to resources such as housing. I know the Department of Correctional Services, they have started with looking at halfway houses for people being released, but we do not have enough of that. And we need housing, we need support in income generation, entrepreneurial initiatives, vocational training, education, anything that can assist people to take control of their own lives, to be able to function independently and with dignity, to be able to support their own basic needs.
It honestly is within our best interest to support former offenders once they are released on parole. Thank you very much, Betzi, for your insights. That's eNCA CEO Betzi Pierce. To this story.